Everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at other types of minority protests that were inspired by the African American movement for freedom that began in the 1950s. We're going to look at four groups specifically today. We're going to look at women, we're going to look at Native Americans, Mexican Americans, and what is known as the Chicano power movement, and also look at gay and lesbian and transgendered rights in this time period. So let's start with talking about feminism. That's a phrase that we often use in our modern society, but ultimately, it's the idea that women can occupy the same spaces as men and that they can still retain their sense of womanhood without giving up any kind of power, authority, or autonomy. And I want you to consider the three words you see upon the screen. You see Miss, Mrs., and Ms. And what exactly does Miss confer as a prefix, as a title? Well, traditionally it has meant an unmarried female. When we look at the word Mrs., right, that connotes a married female. And Ms. in the modern world over the last 50 years has come to mean someone who is choosing not to reveal that aspect about their lives because perhaps why does it matter whether someone is single or married? But at one time, these were actually legal distinctions. At a time when women didn't have property rights, didn't have a right to vote. Miss meant you were a ward of some male member of your family or still essentially under the control and authority of your father. Mrs. meant that this had been transferred now to another man who was your legal husband. Those two titles, especially as women entered the workforce in the 1950s and 60s, especially, there's going to be some prejudice assigned to them. And some of that is going to see throughout the period well into our modern era. The idea that if a woman is married and perhaps in her early to mid 30s, that might mean that she's going to have children. A prospective employer might decide, you know what, I don't want to necessarily hire someone who's going to be taking some time off from their job. Men don't have to identify themselves this way, right? If I'm a single young man, I'm still Mr. If I'm an older man with children who's married, I'm still Mr. So the idea of Ms., which was created by one of the people we'll talk about here in a moment, was that you could remove that element of status, which obviously by the 1960s and 70s was no longer a legal status in what it had once meant, but just to literally, why does it matter? When we look at a woman, why does her status, single or married, matter? When we speak about feminism, we often talk about it in waves. So, a rising action that culminates in some goal, and then we see it again and again. The first wave of feminism we've already learned about. That's ultimately everything from Seneca Falls to the 19th Amendment. This is going to be the time period that's really about de jure segregation, discrimination of the sexes. And you can definitely see that up until the 1880s, 1890s, women didn't have property rights. They certainly didn't have rights to their own children unless they were widowed. Most educational institutions were not available to them unless they were created specifically for girls, or only a few co-educational colleges that existed prior to the mid 20th century. We also see that occupational equality. Women before really the 1870s, 1880s couldn't become doctors, lawyers, other professions. Really teaching, maybe after the Civil War, nursing were really the only occupations or professions that women could take on that would have been educationally based. After women achieve the right to vote, we have a period of time in which we will see women really not having any major differences made in terms of what we call de facto segregation and discrimination. Women have the right to vote, but there's still all kinds of restrictions put on their participation in public life. Second wave feminism begins in the 1960s, right? Just following what will be the Brown decision, boycotts, protests, marches, the kind of activism we're going to see by African Americans in this period. We're going to see women begin to also question what is remaining of de jure discrimination, and also focusing on de facto as well. But this is going to be a time period where workplace inequalities, women can, in theory, go to law school, go to medical school. Very few do. Typically, women are paid far less, and there may be certain aspects of hiring and firing that work against women instead of men. We're also going to see this is a period of time where still women, to a certain extent, don't have full legal control of their bodies. This is going to be a period of time where we're still debating the right to choose, abortion illegal in most states. Um, Doctors, really until the Griswold v. Connecticut decision in the late 60s, could refuse to write a prescription for oral contraception to a woman for whatever reason they felt. So the idea that women didn't really have autonomy about the reproductive rights that men did, definitely issues that were examined and hopefully resolved in this time period. There's also third wave feminism, and that really is focused more on the idea of what we call intersectionality. So ultimately, looking at places in the world where essentially the feminist movement has not happened. Also, looking at the intersectionality between different groups within the United States who may find common cause with some of the de facto and de jure segregation that women have faced. So, for example, even in the early 1990s, a single woman might have trouble adopting a child, but so would a same sex couple. And so, looking at the barriers to those kinds of activities. And certainly in the workplace, minorities and women, the LBGTQ community have often seen that they have been paid less or had, certain exclusionary um, characteristics to their work relative to their peers. And so this is really looking at where people can find common cause with others to hopefully, as an entire group, seek greater parity legally and socially. So the women's liberation movement that begins in the 1960s is very much a freedom movement. We saw a freedom movement in our last lecture. And today I want you to consider that this is going to be freedom from the gender stereotypes that have long held women in a certain role in society and may have also then led to other kinds of discrimination, especially legally. In 1963, this woman, Betty Friedan, wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. And the feminine mystique really examined why she lived the life that she did and other people like her. She was a middle aged housewife living just north of New York City. In the early 1950s, she did not get married following high school because, as she put it, nobody wanted to marry her. So her family had some affluence. They sent her to college. When she graduated from college, she did meet a man. He has already started his business. They got married, they had children. She did not work outside the home. And she found that there were lots of other women like her in her community. And the idea that, especially as their children got older, that they might want to seek a job outside of the home was not something that was socially acceptable. She saw a lot of women who were, taking drugs, many of them prescribed by doctors, antidepressants, because they were unhappy with the lives they were living, but it was not acceptable for them to live differently. And she also kind of questioned the fact that, she had all this education, but it was essentially she could not utilize it and she could not gain any autonomy from it. So, why did we feminize so many things? Why was the work within the household feminized? This is really what she's looking at. And the fact that womanhood is seen as something that still, even in the 1960s, is being looked at as tied directly to motherhood, that a woman who has reached adulthood is a mother and therefore her life has to revolve around that, and there aren't other choices. And even with motherhood, that there can't be motherhood and a profession. This is going to galvanize a whole generation of women. Betty Friedan will work with others to create a political community, an organization known as NOW, the National Organization of Women. They're really going to focus on reproductive rights issues in their first decade. And ultimately, just by writing this book and really shedding light on some of these issues, there are going to be many others who are going to kind of pick up the philosophical and looking at also the other ways we see de facto, so segregation, discrimination by custom. Ultimately, the liberation movement is looking at this idea. There was male chauvinism, and chauvinism ultimately means that you believe that someone has an innate superiority. So, male chauvinism would be this idea that males have an innate superiority over women, and that ultimately that was a mentality, that was a culture that was going to have to be changed, and it might also involve having to change the law if that chauvinism is how the law was designed to support. Alice Paul is still alive and well, ripe old age of 86 in 1972. And she's going to dust off and slightly revamp what was this Equal Rights Amendment proposal from the 1920s. And Congress will pass it. It will be shopped out to the states. It is the only proposed amendment ever to have a shelf life of 10 years. So by 1982, although actually enough states had at some point ratified it, there were states that took back, they rescinded their ratification, in part because they had it on a ballot at one point and then put it on the ballot again. And the public changed their mind. In other cases, the legislatures of those states decided that they were a new group of representatives and they would rescind the vote there. And you can see there also is some very strong regional bias against this amendment. So, what's going to make this different from the 14th Amendment? It's important to understand that in the 1970s, you still have thousands of laws, particularly at the state and the national level, that treat men and women differently. This is before the Title IX portion of the 1972 Education Act. This is going to be long before really any of the work and the changes that have come. So the idea with the ERA was, as an amendment, ultimately it was going to put out into the public sphere that the states, and in some cases municipalities, might actually bar women from certain services. That they would then understand that they had a body of laws not compliant with, they were unconstitutional, and they would change them themselves instead of women having to seek multiple um, venues and different courts trying to eradicate these laws. But that is one way of looking sort of at the du jour um, issue in terms of women's rights, but also the de facto. And Gloria Steinem, who is ultimately the creator of Ms., that title that she gave herself and said other women should take up, she created a magazine that is still published today called Ms. Magazine. And she was an investigative reporter. She did all kinds of things to demonstrate that there were certain jobs that were seen exclusively as female, including secretarial work, those pink collar jobs. And so she took jobs being a secretary as in a corporate structure. She'd been a waitress. She was even a Playboy bunny at one point, just to show the disparity and the sexism that was socially acceptable of the time, and bring light to that. She also wrote exclusively about the double day mentality. She interviewed lots of women because she understood there were women who've always worked. They needed the money. But even in those households, or these in households now where you had women who were taking on professions and were also mothers, which was starting to emerge out of the late 60s, early 70s, that there was this double day mentality. And that's the idea that I go to my job, I work all day, and when I come home, dinner has to be cooked. It is the responsibility of the female head of household. It's going to be the same for cleaning, taking care of children, putting children to bed. In a married household, if a child is sick, mom is the one who takes the day off. And she said, especially in the modern world, like it made sense perhaps in the early 19th century for when you took all day to do laundry, when you cooked over an open fire, that may be a task that is specific for one person to take on that role in the family. It's unpaid labor, but because it's time consuming, that might be a reasonable division of labor. She said by 1970, we've got electric ovens, we have refrigerators, we have washing machines. Dad can put on the box of macaroni and cheese. Anybody can go and use the laundry facilities that are located in the house. And the idea that that is still women's work and it's unpaid, that that was a social shift that needed to happen. And certainly you can see that that shift has happened in most households to some degree by 2021. Perhaps you still know of a household where that is not changed, but at one time, certainly in my own childhood, I'm almost 50, it was rare to see a dad who cooked, who did the laundry. That was the wife's work, the mother's work, regardless of what other paid work she might have outside the house. The greatest opposition to the women's liberation movement was actually another woman, someone named Phyllis Schlafly. A very interesting movie currently on Hulu called Mrs. America that really involves all of these figures, but principally Phyllis. But Phyllis Schlafly had been educated as an attorney, worked as an attorney, married, had children, and she felt that there were certain gender specific privileges, ultimately, with women being able to socially and acceptably stay home, not be paid for their labor, raise their children. And part of this may have been based in the prejudices of the time and the customs of the time. She felt that if women did win this legal fight, and it did become the custom that women worked outside the home, that essentially motherhood and whatever privileges she felt motherhood afforded would be eroded. I would argue that the gender specific privileges may be more economic specific privileges. The stay at home mother is a facet of the middle class, the affluent. It certainly is not a facet of the poor. And so perhaps more what she was speaking about. And Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinem, all of these figures are college educated women at a time when most women didn't have college education. They came from some degree of affluence or built that affluence. They are not perhaps the typical American woman, but Phyllis Schlafly was a polarizing figure because she essentially was the intellectual equivalent of these women. She was the working equivalent of these women. So she was not someone who seemed like she was trying to argue from a point that she was not educated and didn't have other opportunities or didn't want other opportunities. She was someone that was essentially arguing, I have multiple choices. I'm saying that what you are all arguing for will erode the institution of motherhood and the role of women in the family. So, and she lived a very long time. She only died a few years ago. So she often, people came back to her, even in the last decade, to get her position on anything to do with women's rights. The gay and lesbian community is also going to, by the late 60s, be seeking legal redress. Most states, certainly municipalities, and even at the federal level, there was a lot of legal discrimination against people who were gay. Um, what was considered anything beyond heterosexual acts were deemed acts against nature. They were criminalized in the majority of states. Until the late 50s, there were some states where homosexual activity that had been prosecuted on multiple accounts might force someone to have chemical castration. They also, as a community, faced that if they were out, they were not closeted. Many states, it was legal to fire someone or not allow them to have a license. Until the mid 1970s, homosexuality was considered one of the psychological orders in the diagnostic manual. So, to think that, where we are today and prejudices still exist against that community, especially as we broaden that community in terms of other identities, including trans community. But in 1969, there were multiple institutions in a place like New York City that people who were homosexual would come and meet at and drink. It was a bar called the Stonewall Inn, and there were others like it, but the Stonewall Inn was a little different in that they basically didn't pay off the police. So they often found themselves being raided, and typically people would just quietly allow themselves to be arrested because when they were at this bar, they were not closeted. When they left that bar, the rest of their life was one in which people did not know that they were gay. So in 1969, in July of that year, the police raided the Stonewall Inn, and the patrons, most of them young men, decided they were going to push back. On that night, they were not going to quietly go and be arrested. And they certainly weren't going to accept any kind of police brutality, clubbing, um, uh, to the head and body as they were attempting to be arrested. And ultimately, these people were being legitimately arrested because there was a law in New York State that you could not knowingly serve alcohol to a homosexual. So these people who were fighting back, they were going to get arrested no matter what. And that may have been also what accounted for this spilling over into a riot. And people within the Greenwich Village community saw this going on and they came out in support. And a year later, people who'd been involved in this riot decided that they were going to commemorate this event because there were people who were hurt. And it really was sort of the first time that you had the gay community really pushing back. And they did a small march. They got a permit to walk from the Stonewall Inn up Fifth Avenue in New York City. They were not looking to do really what Pride has become, which is now a month-long event in the United States. It's taken on a global aspect, but it began with just trying to commemorate the events of this one night. But this is going to lead into ultimately the federal government having to come and start to look at the discriminatory practices that existed all across the country against people who were gay, and especially the same-sex relation statutes that had criminalized homosexual behavior. All of that is going to start to be unraveled in this time period. One other person I think it's important to mention in this time period is this gentleman. His name is Harvey Milk, and he was a supervisor. He was the first elected gay man in America, and he served in San Francisco for the Board of Supervisors, which is very similar to a city council. Um, as an openly gay man in liberal San Francisco in the late 70s, he still found that there were city ordinances, and even the state of California had certain restrictions and discriminatory practices against gays. And so he made it a goal that he was going to um, offer the leadership and voice to begin to undo these practices. And he was actually assassinated by another member of the Board of Supervisors. And in the tragic loss and just the horror of that murder, we do begin to also see the culture beginning to shift in terms of what had always been a social acceptance of violence against gays. And obviously, we still see some of those things happening today, not to the degree that they were socially acceptable. Essentially, there was not criminal prosecution when people physically attacked gay and lesbian people and transgendered people in an earlier time. And so Harvey Milk's assassination really begins that conversation about why this has been socially acceptable and how is it going to be prosecuted and hopefully go away. If you'd like to know more about the Pride movement, the events at Stonewall, this YouTube link can take you to a nice little 6, 7 minute interview with people who were part of the movement on that night and the original Gay Pride March to follow. Native Americans are also a group that are going to push back. And it's important to consider that Native Americans, certainly since the 1790s, their relationship with the US government and the people of the United States has been defined by the federal government. It's always been on their terms. And that by 1934, in the height of the New Deal, there begins to be some things that sort of work against what had been created with the Dawes Act. If you remember, the Dawes Act is putting Native American people on reservations. They are not to leave those reservations. There are people who are being assimilated through things like the Indian schools, like Carlisle. But Native Americans are essentially in a place in a time of confinement, right? That had been starting since the Jackson period. By 1934, the federal government's looking for ways to spend less money. And that was part of the motivation for what they called the Indian Reorganization Act, which actually unraveled some of the Dawes Act and said that Native people could organize as tribes, and there might be some legal recognition of those tribes. Um, and you do see in World War II people leaving the reservation after their service in the military. But in 1953, Congress ultimately wants to terminate legal recognition of tribes and hopefully, in a sense, in some ways, get the federal government out of the business of the support of these reservation systems. And at that point, you see the Red Power movement begin. Native Americans are saying, well, wait a minute, why are we at the mercy of how the federal government wants to define us? And if you want to, in some way, break down the reservation system, you want to break down tribal authority, and recognition, then there's going to have to be reparations. We're going to have a real conversation about what has been the injustices against Native Americans throughout American history. If you were a young person in the 1960s, you basically are 3 generations removed from the Dawes Act, at least. And so, I know my own students have seen examples of textbooks from the 1950s, 60s, in which it's described that America before colonists arrived was pristine, right? This idea of the pristine myth, that there was nothing here. There might have been a few people, but they were not a civilization in any way, shape, or form. Right? We know that's not the case, right? We've all studied Unit 1 of APUSH. But in the 1960s, for most Americans, they really had no idea. Essentially, the culture and ultimately all of the injustices had kind of been wiped from the public record and consciousness. So, two groups are really going to be active in attempting to create some redress for this. One group is really going to be focused on this idea of reparations or bringing attention to the fact that Native people essentially are owed money from their perspective. Indians of all tribes, IAT is going to do some occupying of government spaces, including what was the Alcatraz Island. It's still there. It's part of the National Park Service. It was once one of the original high security prisons in the United States. And when it closed in the 1960s, it became a place that the public could come and view. And they occupied it in the same way, in a sense, that you had the Dutch occupying the island of Manhattan back in the 1720s or 1620s, sorry. But with the Alcatraz Island occupation, they said, we just want 47 cents an acre. And if you can give us 47 cents an acre, we'll return control of the island to you. That seems like a very little amount of money. It was in reference to something called the Treaty of Fort Laramie that occurred in 1864. If you remember back when we looked in Unit 6 with the West, we can see that the US government had made treaties, said that they would be paying money in exchange for land, and in most cases, either made an initial payment or no payment. And IAT was trying to kind of bring to the national consciousness that the US government bought acres and acres and acres from the Sioux Nation and did not fulfill their end of that contract, and they wanted to make sure that that was recognized. By the late 1970s, this group is going to be able to bring a suit before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will decide in their favor, in the sense that you can't have land returned to you because there's other people occupying it now, but the monetary value with interest should be returned. The Sioux Nation has never taken that money. It is well in the billions of dollars sitting in escrow today, in part because if they take it, they have to agree not to seek any further reparations. But that's going to be significant because it's going to require the US government to have public recognition and essentially have to provide other things, including medical care, vaccinations for indigenous people that they had not been willing to do in an earlier time. AIM is somewhat a similar group. They're going to be really focused on legal justice, especially in communities surrounding the reservations. Often there was violence against Native American people. Because the reservations are some of the poorest places in this country, when Native Americans were arrested for criminal activity, suspicion of criminal activity, they didn't always have the money to afford counsel. The counsel that was assigned to them often did not have their specific interests at heart. Ultimately, there will be a showdown in 1973 at Wounded Knee. And if you remember, that will be essentially the last time that there is any perceived resistance by the Plains Indians to the US government. It will result in a massacre where more than 200 Sioux Indians are murdered. And that experience at Wounded Knee will also be one of violence in 1973. AIM, like the Black Panthers for self defense, believed in armed resistance, and they will come in conflict with the U.S. Marshal Service. And several people will be killed. There will be someone who will actually disappear, never be heard from again. And it will, again, just bring light to the fact that indigenous people have been in conflict with the US government for an extended period of time, and that there needed to be some type of redress. And just the cultural consciousness needed to change about Native Americans and the greater scope of American history. And then our last group is the Chicano movement. And it really begins as a movement for Mexican Americans, sometimes it's referred to Chicano power. And as a group in support of Mexican Americans, it is going to be a reaction to things like Operation Wetback, that the US government in the 1940s needed the labor, especially migrant agricultural labor in the West. The nation of Mexico was happy to allow people to leave and come and work temporarily or eventually to stay permanently in the United States, what was known as the Bracero program. But within a decade or so, Mexico felt that they had a labor shortage in the United States, wanted to curtail this labor in the US, and there was a lot of deportation. So the Chicano movement comes in support of that, but it will extend to other groups. By the 1960s and 70s, you're not only going to see Mexican Americans who are affected by these temporary work programs for the purposes of agriculture, but you're also going to see Vietnamese immigrants, Filipino immigrants. In the modern last 20 years, it's been people from Ecuador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua. And ultimately, you have people, some who are here legally, some who are here illegally. And especially for those who are here illegally, they're really at the mercy of the people they engage with. If you're here illegally, you cannot really command a minimum wage. You might find someone who's willing to pay you that or more, but it can't necessarily be enforced because you don't actually have a legal right to be here. If you are in some way, a victim of violence, the choice is to go to the police and report it, and perhaps something will be done about it. But the byproduct of that is you will be deported. And so there's a lot of abuse against people who are here without a legal status. Um, and ultimately, the majority population in the United States benefits from the fact that this agricultural labor is being done. We have low cost fruits and vegetables year round. Meat processing, meat is relatively cheap in the United States because a lot of the people who work in those businesses, meat packing, and certainly agricultural work are working for far less than minimum wage. And so in 1962, two people, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, they had been community activists that begin to form what's called the United Farm Workers Union. And it is not quite a union in the sense of union shops that we've looked at historically. It really still is more of an organization looking to advocate for people who have no voice. And United Farm Workers, they're going to strategically use boycotts to bring attention to the plight of these workers. In the 1960s, it's going to be with grape producing in California. It'll be for other agricultural products in the decades to come. But just letting the US public know more about the fact of where their food comes from, who's producing it. And the fact is that we have a very porous southern border. There's not really been a lot to do to stop this situation from occurring. When people come here, we know we've talked about, other issues, probably in other social studies classes like DACA, what happens to illegals who have children in this country. So there's a lot of other underlying issues that have to be examined. And the Chicano movement began as one to address this idea of people who come here and work and are working, whether or not they legally are here to work or not, they are working and producing. Is in that fact, does that give them some right to abode in the United States? And the Chicano movement, their feeling for that is yes. All right, so we're going to stop there for today. As you go through, what I would like you to do is make sure that you can see that methods like protest, like marches, certainly the Supreme Court decisions, but ultimately this relationship between the de jure discrimination that is seen against a group of people and then the ways that they unravel that. Looking at the 14th Amendment in terms of equal protection under the law. That's really what connects all of these movements. And that would be an important piece to consider, especially in terms of complexity with the AP exam. Have a good day. We'll see you next time.